You're listening to the Integrated Music Teaching Podcast from Top Music. Tune in weekly as we interview music teachers and experts from around the world to explore creative activities and ideas that build learning connections in students. Our integrated music teaching approach will deepen your students' understanding of musical concepts, engage them in critical thinking, improve their reading and performance, foster their curiosity, and prepare them for a lifetime of music making.
Tara right here, and welcome back to the Integrated Music Teaching Podcast from Top Music Co. At Top Music, we love guiding and supporting music teachers just like you to engage, motivate, and inspire your students and run the most sustainable studio business possible using our integrated music teaching system. It's great to be with you for another week of the Integrated Music Teaching Podcast. Today, we have another special and favorite episode from the archives with the 4-time Grammy Award-winning young music legend from London, Jacob Collier. Jacob shares so many things on this episode, from the story of how he started playing to his approach to chords and harmony, his thoughts on music education, and we're treated to a very special performance mid-show as well.
So in today's episode, I thought it would be good to invite along a young performer who's been making huge waves online and via social media and wowing TV and live audiences globally with his incredible voice, harmony, and the ability to play just about every instrument invented and then loop them all together in one performance live on stage. Incredible. Yes, I'm talking about the one and only Jacob Collier. Let me read you his official bio. It's not often one encounters an imagination with the depth and proficiency of Jacob Collier's. The London-based 25-year-old is dubbed by many as one of the most innovative musicians of his generation. In 2012, Jacob's self-made YouTube tutorials achieved legendary status in the music world, attracting the praise of such luminaries as Herbie Hancock, David Crosby, Steve Vai, and Quincy Jones, who manages Jacob to this day. Jacob's debut album, In My Room, which was crafted entirely in his room at home, and which, if you're a Top Music Pro member, you can actually watch this interview with me and see inside his home studio, went on to win 2 Grammys. His success has led to musical collaborations and fans including the likes of Coldplay, Ty Dolla $ign, Tori Kelly, Daniel Caesar, H.E.R., Charlie Puth, Kalani, Jessie Reyes, and Phineas, to name a few. In January 2018, Jacob began designing and creating a recording project on an unprecedented scale, a quadruple album called Jessie, 50 songs divided between 4 volumes, with each operating within a separate musical universe of sound, style, and genre. We unpack and talk about this today, by the way. Scattered across the 4 volumes are 30 collaborations from across every facet of the music world. Jessie Volumes 1 and 2 both have earned him a Grammy each, affirming that Jacob has never lost a Grammy in a category he's been nominated in. So just before we get into today's interview, I thought it might be useful to actually play a little bit of his music so you can get a feeling for what he does, just in case you've missed out on hearing about him or seeing him live on television. So this is a little excerpt of his piece called Close to You.
So a sprinkled moonless in your hair, golden starlight in your eyes of blue. That is why all the boys in town follow you all around. Yeah, just like me, they long to be close to you.
Okay, it's time to welcome Jacob to the show. Now, I did want to just note that he does sing for us during the latter part of the show, but unfortunately his mic peaked out as the gain was a little bit too high, and I couldn't bear to stop him because it was just the most magical moment. So I was going to cut it out, but it's just such a beautiful and effortless performance. I still wanted to share it. So apologies in advance that there is some distortion when he sings powerfully, but I think you'll still get the message and meaning of what this young man can achieve. And a final note that Top Music Pro members can get access to the video recording of today's interview with Jacob, including a look around his bedroom studio where he continues to do all his recording. And you can see multiple camera views. It's pretty impressive. If you aren't yet a member, you can join on any of our membership plans, including our light $10 a month plan to be able to access this podcast recording and a whole lot of other features. Head to topmusicpro.com to join us today. Well, welcome to the show, Jacob Collier. I'm so glad you could join us for our 200th episode. It is super cool to have you with us.
The honor is mine. Thanks so much for having me on. This is awesome.
Fantastic. Well, you've got heaps of fans in my audience, and I'm included in that, obviously. So my audience has given me a number of questions that we're going to ask as we go through. But I really wanted to just start with your musical background, if you could give us a taste for that. I think from what I've read about you, you've come from quite a musical family. But what was your musical childhood like, and when did you start lessons, and what instrument was that? Because you play about 100.
Oh, well, all very good questions. So I'm talking to you today from my music room at home in North London, and this room kind of epitomized my childhood. Like I kind of learned to walk in this room aged 1,
Right.
Lucky enough just to still be hanging around in it. But this was the room with the piano in it, and rooms with piano inside. Like they're like magnets for children like me. Like I was such a sponge. I love to listen. I love to experiment. And so when I got my hands on the piano, it was a matter of just seeing what kind of magic I could find and how I could translate the things that were going into my ears. And as far as things that were going into my ears is concerned, I was brought up by a family who loved all sorts of kinds of music. Basically by a single mother. I've got 2 younger sisters. And in every corner of the house, there was something to listen to, whether it was like Bartok or Beck or Bjork or Bach or Bob McFerrin. Stevie Wonder was a huge one for me, Earth, Wind and Fire, Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, all sorts of weird and wacko stuff too, And so I think for me, I sort of rejected nothing, and I wanted to try and find a way of explaining these things to myself and understanding them on my own terms. And I guess that my sort of childhood logic dictated that the fastest way to understand these concepts was to start working with them. And so luckily for me, I had this room, and I would sit and muck around for hours and hours and hours. And that process eventually, I suppose, became what it is today, which is exactly the same process, except that a couple more people are
tuning in, and you're recording it as well. How old do you reckon you were when you first started mucking around on instruments?
Monkeying around. Well, I suppose it was as soon as I was old enough to walk and talk. So I guess by 2 or 3, I'd been handed a violin because my mother is an incredible violinist, and both of her parents are also incredible violinists. And so I guess that was the first thing that I tangibly held, other than my voice, I guess. By 4, I'd given up violin. I think I was slightly too impatient. I think because, you need to just sit with the instrument for a while before you can even make a sound. And I think I loved that instant gratification of being like, bang, great, chord, great, I like this, I can sing, I can, And so I was drawn to these things that felt sort of instantaneous and creative. And so the piano, I guess, was where I used to spend a lot of time, just because there were all sorts of chords in the piano. Turns out chords are really interesting and can teach you a ton. And so I got into like transposition, quite early on. I'd listen to a song and I'd work it out, and then I'd transpose it and see how it felt in the different keys. And I used to have this kind of dialogue with my mum, who has perfect pitch, and so do I. And so she would say, how does that key feel to you? And I'd say, well, it feels a bit like A, but it might be D. And she'd say, yeah, well, those colors are similar, but it's actually D. And so I gradually learn, what it meant to be in A flat minor, what it meant to be in C sharp major, and all these different kinds of flavors became increasingly tactile, specifically, I suppose, because of that dialogue that I had with my mum. It was like this language that we could both speak.
Yeah, what an amazing opportunity, having a mum and that lineage through your family of musicians must have really played an impact. You mentioned chords before. I'm a huge advocate for chords, and one of the things that I love teaching other teachers about is how to explain chords and use chords with students, because it's not part of a traditional piano upbringing, as you may or may not know. I'm keen to find out about your actually lessons, what lessons you've had, but tell me a little bit more about your feeling about the importance of, for kids and our teachers listening, why are chords so important?
Wow. I mean, chords were my first crush, firsthand. All I wanted was to understand them. I suppose, in my listening and in my experience as a child, which really was, I guess it revolved around my own imagination more than other people's. I kind of refused lessons a little bit early on, and I only really had my first sort of piano lessons when I was about 15 or 16 years old, and that was within the jazz world. But the only thing before then that I'd studied was the voice. And so as a child, as a boy treble, I had experience singing in a couple of different operatic productions, which was well cool. Especially there was not called The Turn of the Screw by Benjamin Britten, which you may or may not know, but it's just like a wild ride chamber opera. It's incredible. So I guess I was exploring that at the same time as I was exploring Stevie and all these kind of funky things. And I think the thing that I gravitated towards with both these worlds, from the sort of strange classical world to the immensely funky kind of songwriting world, was the chords. And I suppose it's important for people to be aware when they're learning music that all these different forces are sort of playing into what is becoming something. So there's the melody, obviously, and then there's the rhythm, and then there's the harmony. And the harmony is kind of like the meat, I suppose, for me. And a melody means a little before it has chords. And once it has chords beneath it supporting it, it can mean a great deal more. And so I suppose for me, it all starts with triads. You take a triad like C major, which is this one of my faves. And as a child, I used to sit and I used to just rearrange it. That was like the first thing I did, I guess. I thought, well, C is here, and then it's here too, and it's here. And I can open it out, and I can make it really big and wide, or I can make it really small, And so these axes became apparent. You have like tall and short chords. You have big and small chords, high and low chords, wide and narrow chords. And I guess once I started thinking about chords, I was sort of automatically also thinking about sound and how I wanted the chord to feel. And one thing that became apparent to me when I started to experiment with chords is that, first of all, it was like almost like a shortcut to playing songs, because once you can play a couple chords, really you need chords 1, 4, and 5, right? And perhaps like a minor 6 or a minor 2 for good measure. But really you can play almost every song that you've ever heard. And I had one of those brains as a child that always liked to stretch concepts as far as they would go. And so I play a chord like C major, and I think, well, what notes can I add or really sing on top of this chord that makes it more interesting? So I try like a D, which is nice, or an A, which is nice, or a F sharp, which is really colourful, and B, and all these sounds. They all sound different, and they all have different personalities. So the first thing I did as a lover of chords, once I'd got a microphone, was I used to sing all the chords. And once I started to sing them, obviously you can sing them note by note. You can't sing, chords at once, but I found that every note within every chord had a different kind of amount of momentum and a slightly different feeling, and it kind of unlocked an entire universe for me, and I haven't really looked back since.
As we can hear, and so much of what you do is about harmony, and particularly with the vocal work that you do on your Instagram and your videos and your audio tracks too. So obviously that harmony is just absolutely crucial in all that you put out, which is what makes it so rich and lush, I think, too.
Oh, cheers.
Yeah. So it doesn't sound like you had a huge amount of formal musical training, apart from what your mum gave you before the age of 15. Would that be right?
It would, yeah. I learned the most just from experimentation and listening. And obviously, listening is crucial to everybody's learning process. I often liken the process of learning music as a child or an adult to the process of learning language when you're really, really young. And sort of looking back, and I've spoken to my mum about this too, and it seems like a lot of education systems tend to sort of illogically dictate music to students, at least in my experience and opinion. Like when a child's learning how to speak a language, a child is merely surrounded by masters of that language and so allowed to mess around until they find something that they can grapple with, and they get this immediate feedback loop of, oh, that feels good, or oh, that works, or oh, this seems to have had the impact I was going for. This isn't what I meant. And, all that trial and error process, first of all, is very endearing to parents, most often, but also it's massively important, I guess, as a child to realize that there isn't really such a thing as a mistake. There's such a thing as a strong decision and a weak decision, but when you're 2 years old, no one's worried about word order or spelling or grammar or anything like this. It's just much more about sort of gut communication, I suppose, and feeling your way through it. And so with music, I think the thing that I always found slightly strange about education was that there seemed to be this kind of predetermined rule book that made no first-hand sense. But for example, as a music theory student, I had to accept this rule book. And, I'm sure that many of the rules were fine, but I think that for me, I wanted to feel like I could touch something before I believed it. And that was most definitely true for chords. I didn't want to trust that in theory, this and this and this would sound good. I wanted to hear how they sounded and make that decision for myself. And so I guess that for me, that self process of kind of exploring and stretching and going at my own pace, or sort of being on the edge of my comfort zone just because that's where I felt most mucky and most comfy, made the most sense to me. And I enjoyed music education to a point, but I did find that most often, if I had an idea that was a little bit strange or didn't quite fit the rule book, I would be told to sort of quieten down, And it's fine up to the point of, the expression that's possible once you do have a command of a language and you want to just start stretching it and saying these interesting things and combining these interesting flavors, which perhaps aren't necessarily kind of kosher.
The right way to do it, yeah.
Exactly. So I always enjoyed, I suppose, making my own sounds, and my own experimentations that led me into concepts that seemed to exist. But when they existed and they were told to me as a young child, I wasn't interested, but suddenly I was, when I realized that this sound was called Lydian because the fourth had been sharpened. That to me was just the sound that felt like that. But as I began into jazz, about the age of 15 and 16, I had a little phase of being really into jazz. It seemed like people had put useful names on things that I was trying to grapple with. And so at that point, I jumped into the kind of jazz education route for a couple of years, and things started to make a little bit more sense.
Yeah, and you were able then to give names to things that you actually already knew about, but you realized that people had actually been able to say, that's what this is.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Just as one example is, oftentimes in music, we cadence to keys, right? You have like a G7 chord that goes to a C chord. And one thing I had discovered in my thinking was that where a G7 chord can exist, a D flat 7 chord can also exist because it has kind of like the same function, has the same third and seventh. And then once I got into the jazz world, it turns out that has a name called a tritone substitution. And I had never encountered that before, but the idea I'd encountered before. And so I think for me, once I'd entered education with my own language on my own terms, it was just about matching things that I had found in the wild with things that were tamed, and then kind of building bridges between my world and the outside world. And that felt really good at that point.
So one of the things that people are most impressed by with you is the number of instruments that you play. And if people listening haven't seen Jacob live or on Instagram or any of his social profiles, it's quite remarkable. So how has this come about that you're able to play, and not just dabble, but play competently so many instruments?
It's funny, I don't think of myself particularly as an instrumentalist. I try to think of myself as a musician because I'm not really a master of anything I can play per se, but I often have very strong intentions behind what it is that I'm trying to achieve. And I think for me, it was just a matter of learning the music before the instrument. So I knew how to go, before I knew what a bass felt like in my hands. But once the bass was in my hands, it was just like, oh yeah, this note's here, this note's here. Let me see how it feels to pluck and how physical that is and what kind of release it gives me, and learning that kind of dialect of a language that I already understood. So I guess it wasn't a sense of trying to learn music through an instrument, at least after the piano, I suppose, because once I had the piano mapped out, things started to make sense. And it was more like, well, if I'm going to do this thing that I kind of understand a little bit, I want to try it with this instrument because it might make more sense. And so I remember on my 14th birthday, I got my hands on this double bass, which is just over there. And it was really mind-blowing to me that you had, strings a fourth apart, and I had to figure out how to get from string to string. But once I knew where the notes were, it just kind of felt like singing. And so for me, I think as a sort of singer, the most important thing for me was just having the knowledge of where to find the notes in my ears or in my head, and the sort of trusting that those notes would be on the instrument somewhere. I just had to kind of uncover them. And so, yeah, I guess same is true for a few things, guitar. I'm really not a brilliant guitarist, but I normally have an idea of what I want the guitar to sound like and what it's capable of just from all the, 25 years of listening I've done to guitar players. And so I think for me, it's about sort of unleashing it. And I'm often quite impatient. I like cutting corners with technique, because I think for me, technique is just so much less important than sort of intention, I suppose, and imagination. But there are moments when you learn an instrument where you want to do something that you can't do physically. And I remember on the piano when I wanted to be able to go, and I couldn't do it. And so I had to figure out a way to do it. And so I ended up finding out that you had to put your thumb underneath your fingers when you played a scale. Crazy idea, really. And I'd been so resistant to classical piano lessons that I guess that little nugget of wisdom had passed me by. But once I figured out that, yeah, you can flow like that, everything kind of made more sense. And I was able to unleash this part of my ear, which already existed, but it wasn't capable of being released until I learnt that kind of dialect. So yeah, it's a sort of, I guess it's a very kind of thorough form of impatience, like a sort of belief in my inner ear and a belief that I can manifest it in some way, even though oftentimes it's very gnarly and very imperfect.
It's interesting watching my students when they come back from teaching themselves a YouTube tutorial. If they haven't had many lessons, or I've taken them as a transfer student, that ability to use fingers, it's not existent really. And so that little trick, you can put your thumb under to pivot to different areas of the keyboard, is a real eye-opener.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
We had a listener question actually from the son of a listener who said he's a huge fan of Jacob Collier. Because you play so many instruments, do you still practice all of them? And do you have a practice routine to keep up your skills in all these instruments?
Oh, wowza. Well, to be honest, there's a difference between practicing and playing, right? In my lifetime, I've done so much more playing than I've done practicing, but playing can be more efficient at times. There are things that one needs to practice at different points in one's musical life, I suppose, that kind of help things work themselves out. And so I remember, for example, practicing triads for a while because, I was really good at understanding like these cluster chords with all these wonderful notes in them. And it's like, whoa, bursts of color. This is great. I could do this all day long. Oh, this is so nutritious. And then I realized that if I wanted to understand this properly, I'd have to strip them down into the triads that kind of made them up. And so there was one thing I practiced for a while, which was just if you take a major scale, like C major, you cadence to each degree of the scale if every scale note is a bass note. So, for example, you're in C, and then you go to D, and then you go to E, and you go to F, then you go to G, then you go to A minor, and then you go back to C via B. And I did that in every single key. And by the time I'd done it in every single key, I could find my way around all these keys that felt very foreign, right? And so there was a period of time where I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know how to work my way around key centers and sort of tread water in keys. If I wanted to be in D for a while, one thing that classical organists need to study, and they're kind of like the only people left now who are studying these things, is just how to be in a key for a while. Like learn how to be in D, and it feels really kind of natural. And then obviously at the shortest notice you have to be able to change key and go into say that. And I saw people and I was like, why can't I do this? So I sat down and practiced what it meant to just be in a key for a while. But a lot of my practicing felt like play because no one had told me to do it. But a lot of the things I was practicing actually were kind of heavy concepts, And I think that looking back, I've been practicing more than I've sort of liturgically planned and realized that I have been, just because I've been so determined to make something that I like that I've forgotten the amount of work that it takes to do it. One thing, for example, I've done a lot of practice at is working with Logic Pro, which is this recording software that I've been using now for 14 years. I got it when I was 11 for my birthday. And I've spent so many thousands of hours practicing how to use Logic, but I've never practiced how to use Logic ever before, really, by sitting down and thinking about it, because I've just always been making things with it. So it hasn't felt like practice, even though I have been doing that kind of legwork. But I suppose to round off the question, I think that your fascinations and your kind of taste often will dictate your practice routine to a point. And I also don't think that I'm a particularly good case study, because I was very resistant to concepts early on that would have helped me a great deal, like thumb under fingers, for example. But in time, I found it, and I'm a huge believer in, if you follow your goosebumps in a process, and you follow the things that you find exciting from your listening, from your creation, and you put yourself in a situation where you have to solve a problem, and you'll stop at nothing to solve it, you will kind of inevitably end up solving some of these fundamental problems, and you'll develop these kinds of intuitions where, say for example, when I was playing around with chords at a young age, I sort of always felt like this chord was less strong than this chord. And I later learned that Bach, who's like the OG legend, he didn't like to double his thirds very much. But I hadn't really taken that into account with my left brain, but I found it with my right brain after a while. It was like, yeah, I always find myself moving when I have a two thirds in a chord. And the more you do something, the better you get at it. And sometimes I think people sit and wait around until they're skilled enough to get started. But I just don't believe that's true. I think the sooner you can get started, the better. And again, look back at children and see how unqualified they were to learn language, and see how fast they learned it when they were just given the freedom to mess around with it.
The other thing that's quite remarkable is the number of styles that you can play in comfortably too. Jazz, folk, electronic, country. I'm sure you've done just about everything. Wow. I imagine that comes mainly from the listening that you absorbed yourself in. What would you say? Because a lot of kids these days, they may say, oh yeah, I really like jazz, but they don't want to listen to jazz, or they are enjoying learning an instrument, but they're listening to some pretty meaningless rap and stuff like that. Have you got any suggestions for us as teachers with ways we can encourage more listening, because it is so crucial and it's been so fundamental for your own journey?
For sure, absolutely. Well, I think that it's about showing that there are bridges between all these styles. if you're into rap, then you're probably into hip hop to a point. And if you're into hip hop, then you might find Jay Dilla interesting, because Jay Dilla, who's a hip hop producer from the early 2000s, was the first producer to make wonky beats. And now wonky beats are all the rage, like all these bizarre things. We're not in the 80s anymore. It's not quantized. It's like these beats I've always found very exciting. Now, check out the Viennese waltz, because the Viennese waltz is really wonky. It goes, and that sounds like samba. And so everything's connected, whether you're in South America, whether you're in Europe, whether you're in the 1600s, whether you're in the 2100s, whatever, right? It's like music is all connected, and rhythm is one of the best ways to, I guess, describe it. And so I think that for me, a lot of the interesting part of music was not being told to listen to something that I didn't like, which I never really responded that well to, but it was more being shown that I liked something in something that was unknown to me, And sometimes it's just a matter of thinking like, just go and listen to this thing, and then next week come back and just tell me what you thought about it. And you might come back and be like, I hated it. It was awful. And then you can say, well, that's wonderful. Why? And they might say, well, because it didn't have this and this and this. And you say, well, what does have this and this and this? And they might say, well, it's this. And those kinds of conversations open up awareness of what that person is being drawn towards. You can't dictate what someone's going to be drawn towards. But, it took me a while to get into jazz, just because I had to come through harmony first, I got into jazz via harmony, and I got into harmony just via listening and by experimenting and by singing a lot. But I realized that jazz was a music where people could improvise with harmony. Like, they could play melodies that described the harmony. And that was like really cool. And I wanted to be one of those guys. I wanted to be able to describe the chord just with a line, a melodic line. And so I was sort of accidentally landed in jazz. And, jazz is one of many, many things that I listen to, but it's a cool thing to know what you're talking about. And it's a cool thing to understand the music you're listening to. And if you're into rap, right, there's a lot of extraordinarily cool rap in the world. But if you're going to listen to rap, like who are you listening to, and why are you listening to that person? If it's just because they're in the top 40, then I would say you can challenge that person's taste, because they're in your classroom or they're in dialogue with you. And so, I think in some ways it's our job as teachers, or to listen to as much as we can, so that we have the context to meet that student at whatever part of music they are responding to, and have a conversation about that style. Because there's nothing worse than a kind of conservative classical teacher being brought this like lover of rap, and the lover of rap's just like, yo, I'm 14 and I want to be cool, and I don't see why I can't be cool as a musician. And the teacher saying, well, I'm sorry, young man, but rap is just not acceptable. Like, that seems like a real shame. And I think that in the 21st century, there's no boundaries anymore between genre, right? And I've almost made it my kind of creative mission to figure out all these bridges, from the streets of Morocco. I collaborated with this guy called Hamid El Kasri on Jesse Volume 1, which is now I put out a couple of years ago. And then, to someone like Kimbra or someone like Tower of Power, these kinds of bands. It's like, it's all the same language. You just have to be willing to step right up to it and knock on the door and figure out how it all fits together.
Yeah, fitting it together, building bridges, making connections. I'm with you there, and I love helping my students and also teachers as well find those connections between popular music and older music, which they may be more familiar with the Bach, Beethoven, and all those. There are so many connections you can make between that and popular music that's done today. Yeah. Oftentimes because so many chord progressions are shared, of course.
Yeah.
Just before I want to talk about your upcoming album that you're working on at the moment. And I think you've got something that you can play for us, which I'm very excited to hear. But before that, I just want to finish wrapping up your own education, because you were about 15, you did few years of jazz piano. Before that, you hadn't had any formal training on any instrument, I'm gathering.
Yeah.
What happened after that? Because it sounds like you did some sort of formal music education after that. Is that right?
Yes, it is. So when I was 16, I guess I was starting my penultimate year of school. And I realized that I wanted to conquer jazz. I wanted to understand jazz. I wanted to be able to be literate in jazz. And so I went to a Saturday school at the Royal Academy of Music here in London, which is fantastic. And, in this session, every Saturday was a 3-hour session. We learned a bunch of tunes. from older jazz tunes to kind of new hip contemporary jazz tunes. We took them apart, and the people in charge, there's an amazing flautist called Gareth Lecrane, who was my educator for a while there, and he would say, okay, so this tune's in D and it goes here over to B flat, and if you're going to go from D to B flat, how do you get there? Well, there are a few ways you can get there, right? F7 over C is a good example. And then he'd play over those things. If you're in D, he'd say, okay, let's play over the triad, and then let's change the triad to F, right? And then we're in B flat. And so we talk about cadences, we talk about different kinds of scales that you can use, because scales are really important in jazz, and the modes and stuff like this. And again, I realized how much of this I kind of knew, but I hadn't articulated. And so I did that for a couple of years. It was super invaluable. I learned a ton of tunes. It was really cool. After that, the thing I most wanted to do in the world was to stay at the academy, but as a full-time student at the senior academy for a while as an undergrad, and I wanted to do jazz piano there. And I remember in the audition wondering if I should audition on bass or piano, because I could kind of play both, and I wanted to make the right choice. And I remember the head of the jazz just taking me aside and saying, like, I think you're meant to be a harmonizer. Like, I think you're meant to harmonize things more than you're meant to underpin things. And you can play bass as much as you want, but you should learn piano. So I auditioned for that, and I was given the place, which is really, really, really thrilling for 17-year-old Jacob. It was just wonderful. And it was a 4-year degree, and I got about a year and a half into the degree before things really started to skyrocket for me, because I guess on the side of all these jazz classes, I was so busy recording at home, in this exact room. In fact, I was experimenting, I was recording, I was layering things up, I was reharmonizing, I was doing all sorts of crazy stuff. And so I'd go to college. Some of it was interesting, some of it wasn't that interesting. I would obsess over the bits I found new and interesting, and the rest of it I just couldn't care less about, to be honest. I was a very sort of selfish and impatient learner. But I think that what was cool was that I was doing it on my own terms, and I was so determined to have a rounded perspective of things that I would pillage left, right, and center from everyone who could give me some idea of a hand. And there's an incredible a teacher there whose name is Barak Shmuel, who's a really good friend of mine to this day, and he taught me a lot about different kinds of tuning systems, for example, just intonation and negative harmony, and he taught me about groove percentages and swing ratios and all sorts of really interesting kind of mathematical concepts that blew my 18, 19-year-old mind. And I guess by the end of first year, out the 4 years, I'd gone to all 4 years worth of world rhythms classes. I'd attended all of them, so I knew that I kind of knew the syllabus. And I'd also been visiting some of the other classes on campus, like the classical composers oral class, and I was kind of searching for a challenge, I suppose. And in the meantime, I was diligently learning jazz tunes and learning how to improvise over them and stuff. And so halfway through my degree, I sort of got this email from Quincy Jones, and it's rather surreal. And
that's pretty cool to do. Yeah,
it was crazy. And so I realized that I think my time was kind of better spent in the real world, seeing as I'd sponged up as much as I could. So I left the academy there after a couple of years, took kind of what I found most helpful back into my own world, which is really where it all began. And at that moment, I really started to cook. It was like no one was now saying, do this and this and this to be accepted, or doing this and this to get good marks. It was on my gut feeling and my gut feeling alone. And so I went for it. I made an album called In My Room, which I recorded in this exact room. And that was my first album. And it was really exciting to do it. And that album sort of still, in a mind-blowing fashion to me, won two Grammys, which kind of changed a lot of things for me, which is very, very, it was very gratifying and very, very unexpected. But I was so determined to kind of make the thing that felt good that I almost didn't think about it. But I think what I didn't realize about that moment was that a couple of new doors opened up, And so when I sort of graduated from the In My Room era, having done this sort of 200 show world tour, as a one-man band with 10 instruments around me in a circle. I was doing all sorts of live looping and running around in a circle, getting the audience to sing, and there was a visualizer on the back with multiple Jacobs all in real time captured by Xbox cameras. It was kind of a crazy rig. I wanted to do something that was going to be a massive challenge, and that's what brought me to this current project of mine, which is called Jesse, which is with a D, like DJES. And Jesse is actually a quadruple album, so it's about 50 to 55 songs worth
Just
of
setting
music.
the bar low, Jacob. Nice, easy target.
I start with the low-hanging fruit. The goal was that each album would be like a different genre, different space, different elements, different collaborators, different part of the world, different degree of whatever. And I wanted to do this immeasurable thing that would satisfy my kind of infinite hunger for learning, and hopefully kind of sum up my idea of like what music was. you know? And so the first album was an orchestral record, and I recorded it with an amazing group of musicians called the Metropole Orchestra, who are based in Holland. And I did all of the orchestrating myself, and I did all of the arranging myself. And again, I'd never really done this stuff before.
Wow.
Like, it was a real challenge, but I learned so much so fast from it, and it was great. Volume 2 was much more, I suppose, about folk and songwriting, but that stretched into kind of world music and collaborated with people from, as I say, Morocco, and incredible musicians from Mali as well, and also soul singers and folk fiddlers, rock guitarists, you know, Steve Vai and Leanne Lahavas and Sam Amidon and Umo Sangare, all these amazing musicians, and each one of them has its own kind of podcast-length story to be told, but a lot of them came to this exact room, which was really cool, because I'm very at home here, you know. And so I guess that brings me to the present day, which is the era of Jesse Volume 3. And Jesse Volume 3 is the most kind of brazen creation I've ever embarked upon. It's really gnarly and based a lot in sound and sonics and electronics and digital stuff, but also just groove and funk and rhythm. And so, yeah, the collaborators on this thing are kind of consistently blowing my mind. But I've released a song with the mighty Daniel Caesar, and also with Kimbra and Tank and the Bangers, and I dropped a song last week, actually I think it was a week ago today, with Ty Dolla $ign and Mahalia, which is great. And again, each of these collaborations is giving me a wealth of knowledge. And, you know, by being in the driver's seat, having to drive this crazy kind of ever-changing vision forwards, I'm realizing just how valuable the real world is. Like, when you face up to a challenge rather than just talking about it all day long, you learn at the speed of light, which is a very gratifying concept.
Do you enjoy performing with other people more than doing it on your own now, or do you enjoy both?
I love performing with other people. I guess I did a lot of performing on my own, and there was so much learning that happened there. And if I hadn't done that, I don't think I particularly know the ropes as well as I perhaps do now. And I'm also still just getting started because I'm so young. But the nice thing about other people is that you can bounce ideas off them live. You can say, like, what do you think about? And they'll go, well, brr. And then you can have that wonderful musical kind of improvisational conversation, which is so great.
Do you still do the recording in the room behind you?
I do. Yeah, everything's recorded in here. Everything's mixed in here.
Wow, not Abbey Roads or anything yet?
No. Well, actually, I did record one song in Abbey Road.
Okay.
It wasn't.
I think every musician has to do that once, right?
I had to go, man. I had to go. Yeah, that was the first song from Jesse Volume 1. It was with this amazing choir called Voces 8, and it was like almost like a kind of like a madrigal or something very, very pure, just with voices alone. It kind of sets the scene. And I went to Abbey Road too because I had to go there once in my life.
Absolutely. So I think you mentioned at the start you might have something that you could play us. Would that be? Would you be able to play something for us? That would be so cool. Yeah. Sure. Are you able to flip to that the other camera?
Yeah, I can, absolutely. So actually, there's this camera which you might like. This
is pretty cool. So this is the keyboard camera. Can you just go to the whole room as well, just to show that? Because your whole room is. So
this is the vibe. Welcome.
It is amazing, Jacob. It looks like every teenage musician's dream bedroom.
Yeah, it kind of is. I must state that it's not exactly my bedroom. My bed is actually right up there. It's like above my.
Oh, okay. You've taken over this room of the house.
Room, yeah. If I go back to the face camera, so yeah, like that's the door over there. But there's like these guitars that are along the wall.
Oh, that is super cool.
As well, I don't know if you can really see, but I've spent a lot of time in here just kind of messing around with things.
Are the neighbours okay with it now?
They are. They're unbelievably forgiving of me. I'm just so lucky. If I don't leave the window open while I'm making a song, they'll like stamp their foot and complain. You know.
Oh, right. Oh, that's cool.
Which is, I'm extremely grateful, and I mean even more than those guys, to my family for unending patience. And you know, I'm a very nocturnal beast, so I tend to record through the night, and they're ever so patient of those kick drums.
Oh wow, that is patience. It's about 11 o'clock or something there now, isn't it? PM.
It is. Yeah, quarter to 12.
Quarter to 12. All right. Can we watch you on the keyboard camera?
Yeah. Let me go back to the keys cam.
Awesome. Yeah.
The microphone. I'm not sure about it, but yeah, there's a song I absolutely adore called "You Got a Friend," and I don't know if you know it, but it's a truly wonderful song. And I thought I might just finish this with a little rendition of that. That might be nice. I'm trying to think of what key I should play it in. I feel like I guess I'm in D, so I may as well stay in D. And he goes, you can sing along at home if you're listening in. It goes, when you're down and troubles, and you need some loving care, and nothing, no, nothing is going right. Close your eyes and think of me, and soon I will be there to brighten up even your darkest night. You just call out my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come running, 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 running to see you again. Winter, spring, summer, or fall, all you gotta do is call. I'll be there. Yes, I will. I'll be there. Yes, I will. You got a friend.
Oh, mate, yes. All the music teachers around the world listening will be applauding that. That was so cool. Chills down my spine.
Oh, amazing. Thanks so much, man.
That
Thanks
was real. Absolute pleasure. We'll kind of just finish up with just a couple of quick questions, because I know that you obviously had to cancel some tours and concerts and those kinds of things. Is there any sort of online gigs or anything like that you've got coming up that we can tell people about?
Good question. Yeah, everyone's trying to figure this out. It's a bit of a gnarly thing. You can't replicate a crowd in a room. Though I've recently solved a problem which has made certain things possible. I've figured out a psychological hack for the Instagram live duo latency.
Oh, really?
Like, I can basically play duets with people live on Instagram by compensating for the amount of latency that exists by nature in my brain. And so,
oh my goodness,
it's a little series that I've been doing. Yeah, I guess I call it Insta Live duos, and I did one with Chris Martin the other day. I did one with Jojo.
I saw that. Yes,
and Daniel Caesar and people like this, and it's something I'm excited about. And obviously, I have to do a little bit of a kind of brain melting exercise to do it, but you kind of have to be aware of 2 times at the same time. But those kind of happen spontaneously. Means that I can jam with my mates, which is what life is all about. Other than that, I think everyone's just kind of raring to go with this next kind of phase of reality once all of this madness is over. So I'm really hoping that sometime next year I'll be able to get back on the road and come and hang down under. I mean, the sooner the better, in my opinion.
You'll be well loved down here, I can tell you. And last question, how could we as music teachers create more Jacob Colliers in our studios, do you reckon?
Wow.
What can we do to make more, encourage more of what you give the world?
Well, in some ways, I don't think the world needs another one of me. I'm me, but I am me. That is true. But I think that one valuable thing that I've really realized recently is that the best service that a person can do to the world is just to be themselves, and that goes to teachers and students alike. And I think that the teachers who are willing and able to speak from a point of view of kind of trust, those guys tend to, in my experience, get the best results. And when I was a young boy, really my environment was far less about discipline and far less about expectation and far less about even the results of what I was making, because a lot of what I was making was really weird. It was about falling in love with the process of making anything at all, and that process being the thing that was cool. So I would just say, trust the people that you're teaching. If those people are children, then they're probably much wiser than you are. And so keep your eyes and ears open for their ideas and kind of let them climb the ladders that excite them. And if a student can be enabled to feel like their voice is as valuable as anybody else's and that they can be fearless with it, then far more exciting than another version of me, I think you'll have a fully fledged version of them, and that's something to live for.
What a great way to wrap things up. Thank you so much, Jacob, for coming on the show today.
You're very welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
How do you keep up to date with all the latest trends and research into music education? How do you connect with other teachers around the world and make sure your teaching stays fresh and relevant for students of all ages and stages, both now and into the future? I created our Top Music Pro membership to be the one-stop shop for music teaching resources, training, support and community, and I'd love for you to come and join us inside. With over 40 comprehensive training courses, hundreds of teaching demonstrations and lesson plans, free monthly sheet music, discounts and all the business and pedagogy support you could ever need, Top Music Pro is the community you've been looking for. If you're ready to level up your learning from the podcast and join thousands of other teachers in our global network, head over to topmusicpro.com today. If you enjoy this show and want to hear more of our work, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening today. For links and resources mentioned in this episode, visit us at topmusic.co/podcast or check out the show notes. I'm Tim Topham, and this is the Integrated Music Teaching Podcast, a production of Top Music. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy your week ahead, and I'll catch you next time.